Great. Thank you, Claire. Lovely to see everyone. Um, yeah, as Claire mentioned, I'm Rachel. I'm currently affiliated with the Wildlife Conservation Society, although prior to this, as Claire mentioned, I've worked with other NGOs, and I've also been a member of, most importantly, I've been a member of CMP for a long time now. So huge fan of this community, and thank you all for making the time to join this webinar. I am going to try to make this slightly interactive. Oops, I guess I should share my screen as a first step. Can everyone see my first slide?
It's coming.
Yeah,
Yep.
Claire's
It's
nodding. Okay, great. I am going to try to make this slightly interactive, and it looks like my chat screen, unfortunately, oh, there we go. Okay. I'm going to ask you some questions throughout the webinar, so be ready to type in the chat. I'm hoping not to just sort of speak at you for 40 minutes. So this work started when I was still with Conservation International. I got really interested in this question of, what do we really know about what works in conservation? And I was sort of vaguely familiar with this literature on impact evaluation that was examining those questions with, a lot more sort of statistical scrutiny than we're typically able to apply in our day jobs as practitioners. I continued this work during my PhD recently at Cornell University. And I'm really pleased to share this with CMP today. So today I'm going to cover what is impact evaluation. Some of you may be already experts in this topic, but if not, this is intended to be a very non-technical overview. If anybody wants to get technical later, I'd be happy to have follow-up conversations. Why is it important? When is it necessary? And maybe just as importantly, when may it not be as useful? I'm going to give a very high level overview of some of the methods. That's the very technical section. And so I'm going to give it fairly short shrift today, but I do have another whole talk just about methodology. If anyone would be interested, follow up with me after this. I'm going to cover a bit about what we've learned from the literature on impact evaluation, and I'm going to try to provide some practical recommendations for how this might support your work and how it might weave in with the conservation standards. So what is impact evaluation? Okay, heads up, this is your first interactive moment. So please type in the chat if you have ideas, no wrong answers, about what's the difference between monitoring and impact evaluation. If you've heard these terms before or you think you have a hunch, please type that in the chat and I'll pause just for a moment to let people do that. And maybe Claire or Jacqueline, if you can help me monitor that. I've lost my chat screen again somehow. Up there, no, there it is. Anyone feeling brave? Causality. Impact evaluation is about causality. Monitoring is about performance. Experimental design needed for impact evaluation. Excellent. Okay, love these answers. Oh, timescale. Ooh, that's an interesting one. Okay, great. So we're going to try to explain for those of you maybe who are a little bit less familiar with these terms, what we mean by this using an example. So in January, I got to visit Thailand. This is a place where WCS has conservation sites on the ground. This is a made up example, but you could think about it as places where we're seeking to conserve wildlife. Let's say we had monitoring data that was tracking the population size, in this case of a native cattle species called gaur, over time. And let's say we're working at 3 different sites. So at the first site, the population size is doing what? Somebody pop in the chat. Over time. It's a really easy one. Increase, thank you. Positive, right? So this is a positive trend in the population size. Thank you very much. Excellent. See, you're all experts already. At the second site, your population of gaur is stable. And at the third site, your population is decreasing. So there's a negative trend. This is very important knowledge, right? This helps you inform your work. It helps you understand the status of this species over time. However, let's say you had data from comparison sites or a counterfactual. Counterfactual is a site where everything is roughly the same as the sites where you're working, except for your presence in the place. All right, so in the first site now, let's say you had information that because your conservation was so successful, the tiger population was also growing and tigers were eating your gower. So despite you having a positive population trend, the impact of your conservation at this site is actually, oops, I think my animations are a little bit out of order. The impact is actually negative, right? So the difference between the red line and the blue line, the red line is what would have happened in the absence of conservation. You actually would have had more gower, but because of the tigers eating your gower, there's actually a net negative impact of conservation at this site. At the second site, you have information from a comparison site that got invaded by domestic cattle that introduced a disease, and the population at your conservation site held stable. But you have reason to think that if it weren't for your conservation actions, the population of gower, because of this disease introduction, actually would have declined. So your impact at this site, even though the population is stable, is actually a positive effect. At the third site, your population declined a little bit, maybe because of those tigers. At the comparison site, the gower also had some tiger predation, and so there was really no difference between the site where you were working and your comparison site. So going back to my original question, what is the difference between monitoring and impact evaluation? And as many of you rightly pointed out, so monitoring answers very important questions. Did we do what we planned to do? Are we observing the intermediate results that we expected? Are the threats stable, increasing or decreasing? And are our conservation targets stable, improving or declining, right? All super important information. And this is sort of the bread and butter of the conservation standards, right? Monitoring threats, monitoring, whether you did what you said you were doing, intermediate actions, and then ultimately the effect on your target. Impact evaluation is a much more narrow question, which is what is the impact or the causal effect, as many of you talked about in the chat, causality of our intervention, right? So it's a subset of monitoring and evaluation. It's a much more specific form of monitoring and evaluation that seeks to get at this causal link between your actions and their effects. So where does this all fit in? So evidence comes into play in many places in the conservation standards, right? When you're thinking about, your ecological viability assessment, your threat assessment, your strategy selection, when you're doing monitoring, when you're analyzing those results and you're sharing. Impact evaluation is, again, a very specific question that comes in at this stage, which is where you really identify whether you need to demonstrate causality, whether you have sort of a higher burden of proof where you need to show not only is the gower population increasing or stable or decreasing, but what has the impact of your conservation action actually been? Okay, so why is all this important? So some of you may be familiar with this case study from a couple of years ago. It got a lot of press. It was a case in which a number of carbon offset projects, forest-based carbon offset projects, were shown to really have no statistically significant effect once the researchers controlled for other things going on. So this was a specific case. For example, there were some projects in Brazil where overall deforestation in Brazil declined during a certain period because of government forestry regulations and because of a change in commodity prices. And these projects really, in most cases through no fault of their own, were claiming credits for this decline in deforestation that once the researchers looked more carefully was really happening everywhere. So while they were claiming that they were in this world of a net positive effect, in fact, they were really having no significant effect, or in some cases, even a negative effect. Deforestation was actually worse in some of the sites. So what is the problem with this? So if you are in this scenario where your population or deforestation trend or whatever you're monitoring appears to be going in the right direction, but your counterfactual indicates that even without your intervention things would have been better off, what might happen? So this is another interactive question. So quickly type in the chat, what's the problem with this, right? These scenarios in which your monitoring data, your trends data doesn't really align with actually the direction of the impact that you're having. I'll pause there if anybody has some ideas in the chat. What's the consequence of this, or what's the implication of this for your conservation work? Scaling efforts that are not working, right? Exactly. Maybe you're scaling up a project that appears to be very successful, but actually is not having an effect. Donors might pull your funding, right? Reputational damage. That was the really scary cautionary tale of those carbon projects. Could actually be a harmful effect. Waste of resources, exactly. So these are the kinds of examples that I was also thinking about. So you might make incorrect management decisions, right? Because you don't actually know the direction of your impact. You might miss out on funding opportunities. So this is the case where your Gower population is stable, but it's actually much better off than it would have been. And so you may actually be able to, you may be missing opportunities to share that story with donors and actually get support for your work. So causal effects are often painted in this sort of negative light, but we can think about this as a missed opportunity also. And as someone mentioned, you could be wasting resources. Excellent. I love you guys are so interactive. Please keep it up. Thank you. Okay, so when is impact evaluation necessary or not? Okay, next interactive question. There's only a couple more, I promise, and then you can take a break. So when might we need impact evaluation? When might this be sort of a higher burden of proof where we might want to demonstrate a causal effect rather than a trend? Can you give me some examples in the chat? When budgeting for interventions, before scaling up a pilot, when you need to show or prove that projects have an additional effect. Exactly. So that's the carbon offset example where they had some really sort of requirement. A lot of carbon offset, well, really all carbon offset projects have to demonstrate an additional effect above and beyond what would have happened in the absence of their conservation. High uncertainty and high risk. Very good. When the grant report is due, and when you want others to adopt your approach. Thank you. Keep it coming. Exactly. Okay. So I've been trying to boil this down to when might we need impact evaluation? Because later I'm going to talk about how honestly these methods are more complicated, they can be more costly, they can require more time, they require more specialized expertise. And so we really probably, not probably, in reality, we actually cannot implement full scale impact evaluation for most of our projects. So we really need to think about when is this really necessary? So I would argue these are just my ideas. So I would love to sort of pilot test these with this community. But when an intervention is based on a sort of untested strategy where there's sort of insufficient evidence for the efficacy of the intervention, right? I've done a lot of literature review. I've read a lot of papers that show that, for example, protected areas, when they are well resourced and well managed, and when they are put in the right locations, that's a lot of qualifiers, are very effective at reducing deforestation, right? So I think there's a lot of solid evidence that that's the case. However, in most other intervention types beyond other things other than protected areas, large scale interventions like payments for ecosystem services schemes and certification programs, there is still a lack of evidence in many cases. So this is one category where, you may want sort of a higher burden of proof. Risky. So somebody put this high uncertainty and high risk. So I'm thinking of this work I did in Madagascar. We were working in a place that was, there's sort of by definition in Madagascar, every species there, is unique to that place, often highly endangered or critically endangered. So the stakes of getting it wrong are really high for the biodiversity. Also, you're working in communities where people are extremely vulnerable, right? Really high rates of poverty and food insecurity through much of Madagascar. And so the risk is that you're both wasting resources on strategies that may not be effective, and also the impacts on those vulnerable human communities may be very high. So this is another context where I would argue that your burden of proof is much higher, both on the environmental impacts, but also on the socioeconomic side. Expensive or large spatial scope. So somebody in the chat talked about scaling up. When you have a really expensive project, a really large scale project, by definition, your effects could be quite large, right? So this, even if the level of risk at any given place is sort of low, the cumulative risk is just larger. Also, these projects tend to just have more resources, so impact evaluation may be more feasible. Not always, unfortunately. And then causal claims are required. This is the additionality point that somebody made in the chat. So projects where it's sort of built in these ideas of sort of net gain, in the UK, that biodiversity net gain law, or carbon offset projects where you really have to demonstrate additionality, and show a sort of causal link. Okay, I think this might be our last question. When might we be better off with other forms of monitoring? I'll give you a hint. This is a little bit of a trick question. So when might we be better off with regular old monitoring and evaluation the way it's recommended in the conservation standards? Can you type in the chat? So this was a little bit of a trick. Every other project, right? We aren't. Most of the time, regular monitoring is always needed, exactly. So this is really like built into the DNA of the conservation standards, right? This idea that you need to do some monitoring of something, right? A minimum, you want to know, are you doing the things you set out to do? Are you having some kind of intermediate effect? Ideally, you're monitoring the status of the threats or your conservation targets, right? So this is always, always, always a best practice. Now, I do recognize that even achieving this requires resources, requires planning, requires capacity. So I don't want to minimize that at all. This is so, so, so important. But I do want to recognize that there's maybe a subset of projects for which you may want to go beyond sort of what I'm calling regular monitoring and evaluation, the more traditional monitoring trends, monitoring threats, to impact evaluation. Also seems like a prerequisite to successful impact evaluation. Exactly, yeah. So again, impact evaluation is really just a subset of monitoring and evaluation. It's a more sort of specialized set of methods that you might want to use when you're trying to prove a causal question, but it's, in the Venn diagram, it's a small part of overall monitoring practice. Okay, I'm shamelessly stealing from Nick Solafsky and Richard Margolius's slide here, but I love this example that they give where they talk about the level of investment in evidence acquisition and analysis on the x-axis, right? So more investment is further to my right on the slide, your right as well, and the probability of a correct decision on the y-axis, right? So the idea being that a greater investment in information will probably result in a quote correct decision, a more effective decision for management to a point, but then beyond some point, you could invest a lot more resources and maybe not gain a ton more information. So they make this point that if there's a high standard of proof, wonder if I can hide this video panel. I can. Oops, nope, that's not what I wanted to do. Hide this floating meeting controls. Sorry if that was blocking I'm not sure if that was blocking your screen or just mine. So if there's a high standard of proof, so these are these examples that I was talking about where it's maybe untested, risky, more expensive, causality or additionality is required, it may be worth maximizing your evidence, AKA using what they call the gold standard analysis like impact evaluation. But in many cases, it's probably better to maximize your return on investment using the quote aluminum standard analyses, right? So I've maybe biased you a little bit by giving examples of when the direction of your monitoring trend actually is different to the direction of your impact. But that's not always the case, right? Sometimes those arrows actually may be aligned, and therefore your monitoring trend actually is giving you accurate information. It's just that you can't necessarily know without these, again, sort of more scrutiny with these methods. Okay, so a moment on methods. And I'm going to actually start by telling you examples of methodologies that are not impact evaluation, because this is where really the problem lies. This is the challenge for these kinds of approaches. So methods that are not necessarily impact evaluation, meaning they don't necessarily give you the right answer, there's a technical term for this. This comes from the economics literature. They call it the false estimates of the counterfactual, meaning it's trying to demonstrate a counterfactual, but it actually isn't doing it for various reasons, which I'll explain some examples. These include things like before-after comparisons, inside-outside comparisons, or enrolled and non-enrolled or self-selected. That's when you sort of opt in, you have a voluntary um, uh, participation in an intervention. So these are all examples of what I'm going to call apples to oranges comparison, right? So that's, where you think that you're comparing your work to a valid counterfactual, but actually the counterfactual, for whatever reason, actually isn't a valid comparison. So some specific examples of this. There's this great paper by Joppa and Pfaff called High and Far that shows that protected areas globally on average tend to be high elevation and very remote. And in a different paper where they look at the effects of this on the performance of protected areas, they point out that when you're trying to compare, this is an inside-outside design, when you're trying to compare the effect on biodiversity or deforestation or people of protected areas, and you compare outcomes inside the protected area to, for example, a buffer zone. This is a very commonly used approach where you compare, the protected area to, let's say, a 10-kilometer buffer just outside, and you find that things are very different. Part of the problem with this is that things are very different inside and outside protected areas, even before the protected area was established, right? In this case, someone literally protected the top of a volcano. This is an example in New Zealand. And so if you compared biodiversity outcomes or impacts on local communities, inside the volcano versus outside in the buffer area, there's a lot of other things different, right? There's vegetation differences, the elevation's different. So these are called confounding factors. These are reasons why a simple inside-outside design may not actually give you the result that you're looking. And this is a big challenge for me. When I was reading these papers, a lot of them say we compared results in our protected area, let's say a marine protected area, to areas outside of a marine protected area. So you may have a lot of other things that differ, right? The protected area may have been put around a coral reef or a system that's just really quite different than areas outside. So yeah, so this actually is a bit of a challenge for those of us trying to read this literature. You don't necessarily know if the context outside the protected area is really a good counterfactual for what's going on inside. Some of the studies do control for that, or at least try to, but many studies actually, when I was reading them, I actually couldn't tell. I couldn't tell, how those sites outside the protected area were selected. So this is another example. This is from my own PhD work in Madagascar, where we looked at deforestation outcomes in national parks compared to community forests. Again, here the context is very different in these two kinds of sites. You can just see from the picture in the national park, it's this verdant, lush, very remote, very well conserved landscape, higher elevation. The community forests are in landscapes more like the one on the right, and Bay community forest, where there's a road, there's agriculture, there's people living there. And so they're fighting pressures significantly higher than those that are facing the national park, right? So even in the absence of conservation, the outcomes in these two kinds of places would have been quite different, right? So again, this is an apples oranges comparison. The before after comparison is a little trickier, but I'm going to do my best to explain it quickly. So this is also an example from my data from Madagascar. We looked at deforestation rates in Makira National Park, or actually this is data, this is aggregated nationally. So this is deforestation rates across all of Madagascar's national park system in red. Those are the red points. So points that are greater than 0 means there was some deforestation, right? So that's a bad thing. So higher numbers here are bad, more deforestation, at least from an environmental perspective. In the the national parks are in blue. I got the colors confused, I apologize. So national parks are in blue, deforestation in national parks over time, and this is annual. So 1 year is independent of the next. In the community forest, those points are in red. And if you look at just in this case, let's say you're looking at the establishment of a national park, Makira National Park, and you just compare the differences in deforestation, it looks like that park really was effective, right? The blue points kind of tick along sort of at a similar rate. There's some deforestation, but the community forest seems like things got really bad after the establishment of that park. So it looks like your conservation, if you were just looking at the time series, is very effective. But what else happened during that period? This is the problem with these before-after designs. So when I started looking at things that happened in time that could have been confounding, there were cyclones, there was a political crisis, there was an El Nino event. And if you look at the years of the cyclones in particular, Cyclone Helen and Cyclone Inau, 2014 and 2017. Now, if you think about community forests and national parks in Madagascar, you may not be aware of this, but the community forests tend to be established in the buffer. So when a cyclone hits, where do you think it hits first? So you have this sort of differential impact of forest cover loss. And it may have nothing to do with the fact that the designation is national park versus community forest. So there's things that happen in time that confound your simple comparison of before after. This is the same problem in Brazil, where they looked at those carbon offset projects. There were things that happened in time, a change in policy and a change in commodity prices that actually explained the deforestation more so than the offset project. So this is a tricky challenge for these projects. Picking a reference site is also a challenge. So this is from one of those news studies about that carbon offset sort of scandal a couple years ago. They showed that some of the reference sites that were picked for the carbon offset projects really just weren't good counterfactuals. So in this case, there was a project area and there was a reference site. The reference site had a town in it. It had a road running through it. And so if you just compare deforestation rates in these two sites, the outcomes were very different but it might not have been sort of the fault of the project or the, sorry, the might not have been the effectiveness of the project that was causing that difference. It was a really different level of background pressure. Okay, so I think I've made this point about apples and oranges sufficiently. All right, only 2 slides on methods, I promise. So this is where we try to go from an apples and oranges comparison to an apples to apples comparison. The classic example from scientific methodology is the use of a randomized controlled trial. These are extremely rare in conservation, at least for these large scale interventions, right? It's possible to do randomization sort of at the plot level or the local scale for certain kinds of interventions, the effectiveness of invasive species control, for example, but at a large scale, when you're talking about creation of protected areas or creation of carbon offset projects, it's really not feasible in most cases to randomize. There are some exceptions to that. So there's some great work that was done in Bolivia with a payment for ecosystem services program where they actually did randomize over a large area. Similarly, there's ongoing projects in the Comoros Islands. There's a carbon project from Uganda where they were able to randomize, but very unusual. Maybe 3 examples that I've seen published in the literature. The vast majority of impact evaluations where they're trying to get at this quantitative question is something called quasi-experimental designs. They use methodologies such as statistical matching, differences in differences, instrumental variables, regression discontinuity design. These are these methods where, as I warned you, they get quite technical, they require specialized statistical knowledge, and honestly, this is the reason I ended up leaving my job at Conservation International and going and getting a PhD was to learn these methods, right? These are really out of reach, I would say, for the typical practitioner, unless you happen to have been trained in causal inference. Even most statistical classes don't cover causal inference in my experience in graduate school. So this is kind of a specialized niche knowledge. It came from economics, so questions of whether policies were effective or public health interventions, things that were large scale, where randomization really wasn't feasible or ethical for various reasons. So the methodologies are quite well established in other disciplines, development sector, public health sector, education, policy, but are really just now becoming more common in conservation. There's this great resource I'll mention in a minute, published by the World Bank. It's free, it's a PDF, it's a non-technical guide to these methods. There's no equations in the whole book. Highly recommend if anybody wants a non-technical introduction to quasi-experimental methods. There's also qualitative methods. I'm not actually familiar with these methods, but I know they exist and I want to learn more. Some examples include process tracing, general elimination methodology, contribution analysis, and realist evaluation. There's a paper that I've been meaning to read and haven't got to yet. That's a guide to qualitative attribution methods that I've heard is quite a useful resource. These methods, I suspect, would be probably more practical for conservation practitioners. But again, I haven't used them myself, so I'm still learning. Okay, just another plug for this impact evaluation and practice book. It's free, it's online. There's 2 editions. I think it's been updated. It has little cartoons. It has some examples of how the methods work. And you don't have to have a background in econometrics to read it. So very useful guide. There's also a paper that just came out in a special issue of Conservation Science and Practice. I'm just checking on time. Okay. That this is a little bit technical. So this is for somebody who does have a little bit of a background in some of these methods. I think maybe after the talk today, you probably have, most of what you would need to understand this paper. It's aimed at people who have decided that impact evaluation is necessary. So they've gone through those earlier steps of saying, I really need to know the causal effect. I'm in one of these contexts where, I need to demonstrate additionality. Now I need to know what methodology to choose. And they have a nice decision framework that helps you think about which of the quasi-experimental methods might be applicable based on things like data available. So very useful guide, relatively recent open access. I can share a link after the talk where you can just Google it. There's this whole special issue coming out on bridging the guide between impact evaluation research, bridging the gap between impact evaluation research and practice. And this is a paper from that special issue. Some of the papers have been published, but some are still forthcoming. There's also this great table for those of you that are curious about learning more about some of the methodologies I mentioned earlier, that it tries to give them sort of a brief non-technical description of what it is, when to use it, and what the data requirements are. General point here is that quasi-experimental methods are very data intensive. So this was one of the things I learned during my PhD. You need data ideally from before and after the intervention occurred on the target outcome. So in my case, I was looking at deforestation. I needed time series data from before and after the intervention occurred. So you need time series. You need data from inside and outside, right? Sites that are the intervention sites and sites that are non-intervention sites. And this is the kicker, you need data on confounding factors. So those things I was showing about roads and population density and things like El Nino years and cyclones, you need all of that data to try to basically control for those things, right? So this is why a simple before, after, inside, outside comparison, or even a batchy before, after control impact kind of methodology actually may not still control for those confounding factors for all those reasons I explained before. So these quasi-experimental methods, the advantage of them is they can be done after the fact versus a randomized controlled trial, what you have to set up from the beginning, right? You can't do a randomized controlled trial later. So quasi-experimental methods can be done after the intervention, but they're very data intensive and that makes them more challenging to apply. Okay, so quick pivot to the literature. I do have another whole talk about sort of summarizing the literature of conservation impact evaluation. I don't have time to get through that today, but I'll just mention that I did this. I was doing my PhD during COVID, couldn't do field work, so I had a lot of time to read papers. I reviewed a whole bunch of conservation impact evaluation studies. I was looking for studies that were either experimental, so very few studies that were randomized, controlled trials. And I read mostly, the vast majority of the papers I read used one of these quasi-experimental methods. I summarized them and I put them in a database, and I'm happy to share this with anyone. Email me afterwards. This is not a comprehensive list. It's not systematic, but there's about 140 papers and counting in here. I categorized all the papers by their location. So what country or countries did they cover? What methodologies did they use for the impact evaluation? What intervention type were they evaluating? And I was quite broad. I wasn't focused on any particular intervention type.
Thank you.
And I looked at what kinds of outcomes they were evaluating, whether it was environmental, ecological outcomes, or socioeconomic outcomes, or both. A small subset of studies looked at both, and what the direction of the effect was, the actual impact. Was it positive or negative, or was there no statistically significant effect, or were there mixed effects? There were a lot of papers that had mixed effects. For example, different protected areas categories may have different kinds of effects on deforestation. So happy to share that resource. I would love to build this over time. I'm trying to get somebody to use AI to help add the next 140 papers to this database. There's not an infinite number of impact evaluation studies out there, so I think this is quite a feasible problem. I just don't have time now that I have a full-time job. Okay, so broadly speaking, a lot of these papers do report positive effects. So in blue are the number of impacts. Some studies studied more than one impact per paper. So it's not the number of papers, it's the number of impacts. So, a majority of studies are finding positive effects, either environmental outcomes, which includes both ecological outcomes, but things like behavior change, or socioeconomic impacts. This is impacts of conservation on things like poverty outcomes or employment. So there were a lot of positive effects, which is, great. But the ones that worry me, right, are the ones that actually show a negative effect on people, right? This is some kind of harm being done to local communities, typically by the presence of the conservation intervention, or where there's really no statistically significant effect, right? You're doing conservation, but the Gower population would have been just as good, just as well off if you hadn't been working there at all. So this is a case of wasted resources. So these are the studies, that concern me as a conservation practitioner. What have we learned more generally? Protected areas, as I mentioned, and payments for ecosystem services programs, when put in the right locations, reduce deforestation, right? So there's a very narrow subset of studies that looked at those two intervention types, protected areas and payments for ecosystem service programs. And there's enough of those studies from around the world, from a bunch of different contexts and a bunch of different locations that show, on average, they do reduce the loss of forest. So that's good. That's a good outcome. For other kinds of intervention types, other than protected areas and PES programs, and for other kinds of impacts, so things that aren't deforestation, actual, populations, wildlife population trends or socioeconomic impacts, in my personal opinion, we still don't have enough studies to generalize. There may be individual studies from individual contexts that show, very rigorously that these projects work or weren't working or were working in some circumstances and not others, but we can't really generalize. So there's still a big gap in this literature, which is it was unfortunate for me. I was really hoping I would have some kind of answer about what we know and what works in conservation. I also began to get a sneaking suspicion that this literature is limited and biased. So we've all probably been part of studies. This is me in the forest in New Hampshire in 2011 taking data on trees. We've been part of research that never actually gets published, right? We may know, whether something was working or not, but we don't have time to write it up, get it published. Maybe we don't have the capacity. We graduate, we move on to the next job. So we know that there's a lot of knowledge out there not getting captured. I also worry that there's papers that never get submitted. So I had a colleague at an organization that wrote an impact evaluation study of a program that showed no statistically significant effect of that program and was asked not to publish by his organization because the program was very popular. It was building goodwill with communities, and the concern was that they would sort of lose their opportunity to operate in this place if there was a demonstration that the project really for environmental outcomes wasn't effective. Now, that's not to say that it wasn't effective for other reasons, right? Building goodwill with communities is absolutely a prerequisite to doing conservation. But if you were just looking narrowly at, the biodiversity outcomes, there really weren't any in that case. And then last but not least, there's a publication bias, right? So journals are more likely to publish a paper that shows a statistically significant effect or that shows a positive effect. I started noticing that I could predict the direction of the effect of in a given paper by the affiliation of the lead authors. If they were affiliated with conservation organizations, they were much more likely to have a paper that was positive, that was a success story. And if they were an economist in a university setting, they were more likely to publish sort of no statistically significant effect or negative effects socioeconomically on local communities, right? So we also have this bias, right? Everybody knows this, but I really noticed it. This is not a scientific finding. This is just me, my observations, but this actually worried me. Okay, so where do we go from here? I do want to wrap up. I realize I want to give some time for questions. Okay, big picture, even if the results are not significant or even negative, I really don't want the takeaway to be conservation isn't working. Let's just give up. Let's defund this project. So this was one of the really scary, unfortunate consequences of that carbon offset scandal was that a lot of investors just said, well, we've lost faith that investing in reducing deforestation in the tropics works. And so they pulled their money out of the carbon market. And some of the authors of some of those impact evaluation studies said, wait, that wasn't the message we wanted you to take away. We wanted you to think about how can we learn and improve and do better. So, this was a really, unfortunate outcome from conservation. Even bigger picture, I was thinking about this a lot. I got to go to the COP in Colombia, the biodiversity COP. And there was this number that kept getting thrown around, how much money we need to actually achieve biodiversity conservation goals globally. Something like $700 billion a year to achieve conservation. The amount that's actually invested is between 100 and 124 billion a year. So there's massive gap. So it's almost like saying, hey, this conservation stuff doesn't work, it's not effective, therefore, let's defund it. That's the wrong message, right? Of course it's not working. If you're working in this context, you don't have enough resources. It's really holding yourself to a very high standard to say, can we really move the needle in terms of biodiversity when you're vastly under-resourced at a global scale? Another sort of practical thing that I can recommend is to know where on this graph you are, right? Are you at that point where you really need sort of statistically significant, information to demonstrate causality? Or are you in this other place where the vast majority of projects, land where you need some information, but maybe you don't need to make causal claims. So this may help you, decide when impact evaluation is really necessary and worth the additional, frankly, cost, effort, capacity. I also have been thinking about specifically within the conservation standards. So my colleague that wrote that paper, that's sort of the guide to counterfactual methods, she talks about counterfactual thinking. Like, can we imbue a bit of everything we do with this sort of idea of, what would have happened in the absence of our work? I feel like we're all trained, many of us were trained in ecology, in experimental design, right? Which is thinking about, how do you set up an experiment to really demonstrate that something works or doesn't work? And then it's almost like we graduate from, our graduate program and we get out into the real world, and it's like we take off our science hat and we just get into practitioner mode, and we're just like, okay, like let's develop a theory of change, let's think about our assumptions. But we sort of lose this sort of counterfactual thinking of like, what would be necessary to really demonstrate that something's working. So I almost wonder, I was thinking very practically, like what could we do? Like, should every theory of change maybe have a counterfactual theory of change? Like, what would have happened in the absence if we didn't do the thing that we said we would do? What would the outcome be? And which of these arrows, these hypotheses on our theory of change, do we maybe need causal data for, relative, or just sort of evidence that, we did the thing we wanted to do, and it's generally things are ticking in the right direction. um, Paul Ferraro also, he's published a number of these impact evaluation studies. He really is recommending that practitioners and donors think about experimentation. So those quasi-experimental methods that I mentioned, they're complicated, they're data intensive. You got to go, get specialized training or partner with an academic expert to really apply them. So he was talking about, could you do some light experimentation? Could you vary the intervention slightly across your sites? You've got 3 sites in Thailand. Are there things you could do slightly differently and compare outcomes? Can you do phased treatment? Can you use, we can't do everything everywhere all at once. Can you use your later sites as controls for your early sites and collect data in both places? Now, neither of these are going to get around all of the problems, the apples to oranges problems I mentioned before, but they might provide you some clues and some slightly better information than you would get with sort of traditional monitoring. Last but not least, partnering with the experts. So there's these communities. There's a webinar series monthly on Tuesdays called Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual. If you go to the Society for Conservation Biology website, there's an impact evaluation working group. You can find a link there, or I'll try to share it after the webinar. It's a super useful webinar, introduction to impact evaluation methods. My goal has been to bring these communities together, right? So there's these mostly academic researchers that are playing in this space of causal inference, impact evaluation research. And then there's us in CMP that are on the practitioner side that want the answers to these questions, but often don't have the capacity and the resources to answer them. I think that there's a lot of capacity for us to work together. And then, of course, there's movements like the Conservation Evidence Platform, where they're trying to gather a lot of evidence that may not make it into peer-reviewed literature and support conservation practice. I do think that there's a perception that investing in impact evaluation takes money away from implementation. So my recommendation is to work with these researchers and academics and do joint fundraising to make the pie bigger, especially now, right? The funding is just too tight. But I do think there's an opportunity to collaborate and say, can we go for a joint proposal? So the money is in addition to the implementation cost, and isn't perceived as taking money away from implementation. I take heart from the fact that there is this growing community of practice. So this was an ICCB session in Kigali. There was standing room only. People by the end were overflowing out into the hallway. And I think there's really a lot of interest, and these are students and faculty. They've learned the methods and they're coming out and they're hungry to help work with all of you to apply them. I mentioned the special issue already of Conservation Science and Practice, Bridging the Impact Evaluation Research Practice Gap. It's a number of case studies of impact evaluation projects, so don't need to say more about that. And I'll just leave you with some wisdom from Paul Ferraro, which is that he'd like to see conservation change its guiding ethical precept from do something because we're in a crisis to do no harm. So again, he's really focusing on those studies that show that there may be no statistically significant effect or actually a negative effect, and let's try to learn from them and do better. with that, thank you. And hopefully I left a few, oh, thanks for sharing those links in the chat. Hopefully I left a few moments for questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was fantastic. We've got 10 minutes for questions, so I'll dive straight in. You've got a question from Angus here. The question is just wondering to what level can different timber harvesting practices be accommodated in impact evaluation? For example, selective timber harvesting, such as Palo Santo, rosewood, etc., exists within national parks, while non-selective timber harvesting outside, because the rare timber doesn't exist outside of the national parks. Therefore, how sensitive does one have to be in selecting comparative studies?
That sounds like a very specific question that I'm not sure I'm ready to answer. So it sounds like a case in which the intervention inside the protected area is not equivalent to the intervention outside of the protected area, which would be a very tricky case study for impact evaluation because you really, again, you need to try to have an apples to apples comparison. There are methodologies. I'm answering this off the fly. I think my short answer should be consult an expert if you're interested in designing a study to evaluate this. There's methodologies, including something called synthetic control, that are intended to work with very small sample sizes. Basically, for example, if you have one treatment site, can it give you a valid counterfactual for that one treatment site? But it sounds like a very challenging question, and that's one of the problems for impact evaluation. It's very hard often to evaluate things when things really are just unique in a particular setting. One other broader comment I would make about that example is the kinds of studies I was looking at were trying to ask big picture questions. Are protected areas effective? And protected areas are often made up of multiple interventions. So there's a lot of things that go into the creation and management of a protected area, right? You've got patrols, you've got legal designation, you've got boundary demarcation. And therefore, this question, it's almost sort of like a smushing together of a lot of different, more specific interventions. And the question is broadly, does this work? There are, of course, studies that you could do that are more sort of plot level, site scale experiments where you look at specific interventions, like do ranger patrols work, which is a more specific intervention type, and it's also a useful question to ask. But I was looking at these sort of big, these sort of like big kind of messy intervention types, if that makes sense. They're often, and I'm using big because they're often large scale, right? And they often combine multiple interventions. But I don't have a great answer off the top of my head.
Hopefully that helped you, Angus. Feel free to add to your question if you'd like to. Next question is from Nadia. What kind of indicators or data points are usually used to look at socioeconomic impacts?
Great question. I have a slide somewhere. Let's see if I can pull it up. So there's a real growing diversity of different intervention types explored by, or sorry, different outcome types explored by socioeconomic studies. I don't have the slide handy, unfortunately, in this deck. Often they look at things like poverty. So there was this big question about conservation, whether it was alleviating or exacerbating poverty, wages, income. There's a great paper published that looks at protected area effects on household consumption and nutritional outcomes using Department of Health and DHS surveys from USAID. So it's a growing diversity of types, and that was one of the challenges for me, which is that it was very hard to generalize because often the study was based on one particular indicator in one place or a set of places, and there weren't enough of any one study to generalize. But often it's something about poverty, household consumption, things that you can study using available secondary data sets.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Alrighty.
can
Charles
share
is
and I can share that database with anyone who's interested to see what kinds of outcomes people were looking at.
okay.
Go ahead, Claire.
Thank you. Charles's question's a bit philosophical. He's asking, do you think there are enough people with sufficient skills to properly do impact evaluation to support all the conservation projects that would need it? If yes, where do we find them? And if no, what do we do about this?
So that's a great question. Are there enough of them? There's certainly a growing number, and there's more than I realized when I started. Because a lot of the early papers just said these skills are really specialized and we really need to bring them to conservation, and nobody's doing it. Um, where you find them is honestly that impact evaluation working group of SCB email listserv. So for example, I posted to that listserv, just like the CMP listserv is a fantastic resource. I posted to that listserv and said, would anybody like to partner with me on an AI project to try to build this database? So I've populated it with the first 140 papers. Can we train, a large language model to populate it with the next papers and keep it up to date? And I got 7 or 8 responses right away. So I do think that there is, you know, a large growing number of people that are trained in these methods. Often they're in the economics department. They're not in conservation. So there's relatively, I would say, few of us that are conservation side that are trained in causal inference, but there's armies of economists because this is really, again, much more common in development, public health, and some of them are curious about causal questions. I'm partnering with an economist at Cornell University who's interested in replicating that carbon offset study, but looking at impacts on birds using eBird data rather than deforestation outcomes. So I do think that there's probably, enough researchers. There's probably not enough resources for us all to actually engage with those people effectively. But I do think the matchmaking could at least be a first step.
Hmm. Okay, we've got a few more questions here. The vendor asks, are there any established methods to account for non-tangible factors, such as goodwill or the willingness of the community to support conservation in impact evaluation studies?
I suspect those factors come out in those qualitative methodologies, because that's where you're often sort of talking to experts, trying to sort of tease out what would have happened in the absence of the intervention. But again, I'm not super familiar with those methods. It took me a whole PhD to try to wrap my head around some of the quantitative methods. Those kinds of studies also, those non-tangible things are very hard to study at large spatial scales. So again, my focus here was really on these like big picture questions. What works and what doesn't? Protected areas, are they effective? Carbon offset projects, are they effective? You can often answer those intangible questions much better at the smaller scale, right? Can you look at a specific protected area and the communities around it and the history? There's great research on those kinds of questions in other disciplines. So anthropology, for example, often looks at those kinds of things. But again, the challenge there might be generalizability, and that's just not a field that I'm as familiar with.
The follow-up question here is, in conservation projects completed in close partnership with communities, how do you ensure that socioeconomic data collection itself does not become a confounding variable for impact evaluation, e.g. by contributing to engagement fatigue?
Wow, interesting question. Yeah, I mean that's sort of a what's that name of that effect? The observer sort of effect, where just for the sake of yeah, just for the fact of being observed, people behave differently, or in this case, yeah, they're getting survey fatigue. I I don't have a good answer to that. You guys are asking tough questions. Yeah, I think socioeconomic data, again, does require its own level of capacity and expertise. I also want to apologize. Recently at the CMP rally, I made a comment that was really stupid in retrospect, where I was sort of flippant about, how difficult it is to collect really good social science data. And I think some of you might have been in the room, so I do want to apologize for that. Like really understanding these social effects, especially these sort of confounding, what do they call that, endogeneity, right? Where the project itself sort of has an effect, is quite tricky. And so again, partnering with researchers that are trained in social science methods. I mean, even basic things like getting honest information from people, right? There's often a bias. People want to tell you what they think you want to hear, or you're asking about sensitive practices or even potentially illegal practices. So, I really shouldn't have minimized the challenges there. But yeah, partnering with social scientists is really kind of the best I can recommend.
Mhm. And then our last question before we wrap up is from Kevin. Can impact evaluation provide a key data point for the coveted return on investment data points that funders and fundraisers love?
I think it's built in. So I think when many of us talk about, the effectiveness of our work, we often use this word impact, right? I think, return on investment assumes you actually understand what the return is, what the benefit is. And I think in our minds, we tend to have this, conceptual framework that the return is the additional effect of our investment. In this case, the donor saying, I really want to know, like, what am I getting for my dollar invested? And so there's sort of this like underlying assumption that we can actually understand that. And I think unfortunately what a lot of papers show is that, it's actually trickier to answer that question. So absolutely, I think unfortunately, in an ideal world, every project would have impact evaluation, but I recognize that we're in reality and that's really not practical or feasible. So I think education, I think working with donors to try to say, what kind of information do we really need to make good decisions? Um, and can we work with donors to actually resource that properly if they really want to know, truly what their return on investment is.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rachel. I can tell you at some stage we had over 100 participants on this webinar,
Wow.
so it's probably one of the biggest webinars CMP's ever had. So thank you so much. I think it's going to be really important, and it's been really interesting for everyone on behalf of the community. We just want to thank you so much for doing this. We will make sure to share the recording on our YouTube channel, as I mentioned, but huge thank you to you.
Thank you all for spending your time with me and all of you who watch this later. And thanks, Claire and Jacqueline and the CMP community for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all.